Hi, well today I'm going to do a video on should I join a union, yes or no. Now I was in the bricklayers union. That's actually my book right there, and you open the book and inside you see where you make your payments every month. So I was in the union about 3 years and I wasn't steady, but how I got in the union was, this is 1986. Brother got out of the army in 1980 and there wasn't a lot of work around, and our uncle worked in the laborers union. So he called my brother up because my brother didn't have much work, was slow, and he went out and he got him in the union. So then my brother actually moved to New Jersey, and back in 86 he calls me up and says, "Man, it's booming out here, they're starving for guys, they'll take you right on, you don't need anything, just a good word from me is good enough." And I went right on, right down, signed the paper, and they sent me right out on the job. So that's how I did it. There was like no journeyman or apprentice or anything. I was a good stonemason, and that's the kind of guys they were looking for. So that's how I got in the union. The good things about working with a union is you work with all different type of guys. It was really booming in Jersey at the time. Scranton-Wilkes-Barre was slow. Texas was slow. We had guys coming up from Texas and New Jersey and Washington, and they were all working. We were doing all kind of buildings. We had I worked on hotels and skyscrapers, malls, big AT&T buildings, schools. I never sat in the hall. They'd call me up and say, "I want you to go here and go there." And actually, you don't actually work for the union. You work for a contractor, and they'll send you with a contractor. And usually that contractor has union guys running the show, and then they pull other guys in as they need them, and then they let them go as they don't need them. And you could get unemployment. Like, I didn't want to go out there in the winter and drive across the Poconos and 6 inches of snow, so a lot of times I could actually just go to the hall and say, "I want you to lay me off for the winter," and that would be the end of it. So it was very good like that. I remember when the union guys were building Topps bubblegum in Wilkes-Barre, Scranton. And it's probably the early 60s, and the guys were coming to work to my dad, and they said, "Chester, those guys in the union are getting $5 an hour." That was big money at the time. Most masons were getting $2.50, $3 an hour. And my dad says, "Well, you could go over there and you could probably work for a month or two, but then they're going to lay you off and you're not going to have any more work." And that was basically what happens. So when you get in the union, you got to look how far ahead do they have the work. How long are they going to need you? And like I said, you actually work for a contractor. And if you're really good, the contractor will ask you to stay with them. There was guys I never seen in the hall. They just stayed with the contractor, showed up every day. The contractor would send in all the benefits and all that other stuff. And at the time it was, you had to have 1,000 hours in and you would get health insurance. And then every year you stayed in the union with 1,000 hours, when you retired, I think it is that way now, you'd get $100 for every month. So if you stayed in 20 years, every month you'd get a $2,000 check from the union. That's how that works. Now there was a lot of guys. There was one guy, they call him Junkie. He was in the union, and when he'd slow down, he'd call my dad up, and my dad would take him and put him on a non-union job. You know, he'd work for us. And then when things got back, he'd go back to the union. Now, some of the crazy things are, we were at a mall and they went on strike. Could have been the drywall people, so everybody walked off the job. Well, I was lucky. I walked across the street and they were doing a stone job on a bank. I did a stone sign. I was supposed to do it on the weekend or whatever. I went across and I worked over there. A lot of guys, they call them lump jobs. I think that's what they call them in Jersey. And that'll be their side jobs. A lot of guys have side jobs. Sometimes they come and they work 4 or 5 hours or something and say, "Okay, you guys keep going," and they go and do their side job. Overtime at the time was I was getting $22 or $23 an hour in 1986. That was good money. And if you worked with the concrete guys, those guys at that time were making over $100,000 a year. And that was like a club. You had to get in on that. That was the in crowd. And when they needed me, I went out with the concrete guys, and they said, well, you know how to run a trowel? Power trowel? Yeah. Okay, you can stay. So we poured this. You couldn't even see the end of it. It was a huge, huge warehouse. And, they were still doing the old school. All the guys would get up there and they, flatten it out. And then they had this 70-year-old guy, which I'm over 70, and he was on the bull float. And then they were pulling the old guys off because they didn't have enough people to be in the union. They were grabbing everybody at the time. But at the time, it was $23 an hour, and then I think it was double time for the next 2 or 3 hours, and then it was triple time or time and a half. I don't know what it was, but a lot of guys who were doing concrete, they'd be there 12 hours a day, or they were making over $100,000 a year. But you worked. Just because you're in the union doesn't mean you don't work. I mean, if you want to keep your job, you got to work, and that's just the way it was. Now, a lot of union guys worked, on the lines. The good guys would be on the corners, and the other guys who worked the lines. But that doesn't mean they could build a fireplace or a set of steps. I mean, they were union workers. That's what they did. And I was on a lot of big buildings where we did block jobs. 2 guys would do on a 12-inch block. Well, they don't do that anymore. What happens anymore is they pour a slab and they stand it up. There's very little block work out in New Jersey anymore on union jobs. I did a video down here in Florida saying brickwork is dead. And for the most part, it is. Down in Florida, it's mostly stucco. And I just seen they're putting a school up, and they are putting the brickwork on the outside of the school. But you don't see a lot of brickwork anymore. Everything's panels. They just stand it up and bolt it together. Once in a while, you get a little side job, like we was building the mall, and they need the bottom of the elevator shaft done. The guy asked me, hey, you want to lay these 20 block? I said, yeah. And you're there for, say, an hour and a half, and the guy gave you $100. That was good at the time. One thing I got to say is, if you're a young guy and say you're out doing your own thing, you can still belong to the union. And if you want to work for the union and get your 1,000 hours in, you're going to get a retirement. I mean, that's what it's all about. But a lot of guys, I know a plumber in our area, he keeps his best customers. He does it on the nights and the weekends, and he works for the union during the week. Now, between jobs, he might be off for 2 months, so he might be collecting unemployment, but he's still out, taking care of his good customers. A lot of guys play it that way. I know a lot of guys who had their own business for years, and then they end up with nothing at the end. So is a union a good thing? Is a union a bad thing? It all depends on your situation and what you want out of it and what union you're joining. When I was in there, they had like the concrete guys and the brick guys and then the block guys, and then they all condensed as they start using panels and prefabs. And I remember walking into the union hall. We had a meeting once a month, and he'd say, watch out, boys, brickwork is dying. They're building all these skyscrapers out of glass anymore, and it is. That's what they're doing. Now, when I first went in, it was funny, they got their own way of doing things. The guys, the masons that come in, they had their bags. I came in with a bucket of tools. Then they looked at me and said, oh, brother. But after I worked for a day or so, they said, oh, this guy knows what he's doing. So I had to buy a new level and get the little thing where you could hang it on the scaffold. Kind of play the role. The thing is, when you're in the union, whether you're working or not, you still got to pay the dues and keep up with that. And every day when you worked on a job, the guy would come around, the head, and he'd collect $5 from every guy. And that was used to pay the business agent, the guy who, was on the phone all the time. And plus you had to pay your dues. So that's a continuous thing. So that's my experience in the Union. I didn't stay in it. I was born in New Jersey, but I didn't want to live out there. And driving back and forth, I mean, I could stay out there for a week. I had a place to stay. And it gets old after a time. And then when the winter winds start blowing, you know, I just didn't want to do it anymore. But it was a great experience. I learned to do all the commercial stuff. And then a lot of times when I'm doing my videos, you know, I could throw some of that commercial stuff in. You know, what was funny out there was they had different names for different tools. Like we'd call it a joiner, they'd call it a striker, vice versa. If someone wasn't any good, a new guy come on, they'd call him a hack or a cowboy. We'd call them butchers. Different names for blocks and bricks and how they did it, which was interesting. Sometimes they'd think I was from a foreign country the way I talked, being from Scranton, Wilkes-Barre. But that was my experience in the Union. I think it was a godsend because I could throw a lot of this commercial stuff into my videos as I go. Thanks for watching. I'm Mike Haduck. I'll see you next video.